All right, in London, where I am now, I want to introduce you to Sir Mark Lyall Grant, who previously worked for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office as High Commissioner in Pakistan, and he served the UK's ambassador to the UN for 6 years. And he was National Security Advisor to two Prime Ministers, David Cameron and Theresa May, until 2017. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Donna. Pleasure to be here.
Mr. Ambassador, can I say, you were in Iran. You went there as part of the negotiations. How many times?
Well, just once. I was the UK Iranian nuclear negotiator for basically a 2.5-year period when I was the political director in the Foreign Office in London. And together with the France and Germany, the United States, China and Russia, we negotiated unsuccessfully whilst I was there, but eventually leading to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was agreed in 2015. And as part of that process, we went to Tehran in 2008 to present an agreed plan by the foreign ministers of those 6 countries. And then we met Iran twice more in Geneva as follow-up meetings to that first one. So we had just the one visit to Tehran.
And what was that like? What was the atmosphere like in Tehran?
Well, I mean, Tehran is I hadn't been there before. It's a very interesting city. I mean, you've got the mountains in the background. I wouldn't say it's a beautiful city, but the setting is very pleasant. And there's a lot of people who, if you meet them privately, can speak perfectly openly. One of the paradoxes about Iran, and particularly the rupture between Iran and the United States since 1979, is that Iran is probably has a population that is more pro-Western than any of the Arab nations in the region. It has greater internet penetration than any of the others, certainly in the Arab countries. And therefore it is quite a sophisticated population. And when you meet in private, as I met with various NGOs and think tankers after the official talks, you can have some very interesting discussions.
Let's fast forward to where we are now. I mean, a lot has happened, right? So now you have people who are calling in Europe, diplomats that are saying France, Germany, the UK must move quickly to set out a roadmap for Iran so that the incoming Biden administration will get the US to come back to the table, get Iran to come back to the table, especially now given the escalating tensions. Do you think that's happening in the background, and it's got to happen?
Yeah, I'm sure it is happening, and it should happen, because there is an opportunity with Joe Biden coming in January to see whether there is a possibility of re-engaging Iran on this nuclear deal. Because personally, and I think I'm speaking certainly for the 3 European governments, it was a mistake for President Trump to pull out of the deal completely in 2018. The deal is perfect. Let's be 100% clear about that. And we can talk about that, the weaknesses in the deal, but it was certainly a lot better than the potential alternatives at the time. It was therefore a mistake to just pull out of the deal rather than see whether it would be improved in some way. So I think Joe Biden...
If I can jump in there, I mean, John Bolton, the former national security advisor of Trump, and a lot of different Republicans have poured so much water on this deal, saying that it's unverifiable. It's Trump himself is saying it's the worst deal ever. Why do they say that? If you say essentially...
Yeah, let me address some of those criticisms, because essentially there are 3 criticisms that you can make, legitimate criticisms you can make of the deal that was struck. The first is that it covered only the nuclear weapons program. It did not cover the ballistic missile technology program, which of course is important too. Secondly, it did not cover Iran's malign regional role. Its support for terrorist organizations, for the Houthis, for Hezbollah, etc. in the region, and its attempts to destabilize some of its neighbors. And thirdly, the deal was time limited. There was a sort of sunset clause in the deal, so it would last only a maximum of 15 years. Now, those are all legitimate criticisms, but you have to put that against the alternatives and history, because if I just could delve into the history a little bit, there was a time when I was in the negotiating where the intelligence was clear. that Iran had the capability to acquire a nuclear weapon, a bomb, a nuclear bomb, within less than 1 year period. Now, this deal did prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons for at least 15 years, because it had some very important characteristics in it. It had in it the need to eliminate entirely the stockpile of medium enriched uranium. It had to get rid of or reduce the stockpile of low enriched uranium, 98% of that. And it only allowed very limited amounts of low enriched uranium for the next 15 years. It also reduced the number of centrifuges by 2/3. And most importantly, and this goes against some of the commentary that you've mentioned, it was entirely verifiable. There was a whole regime of inspections by the
UN.
Energy, by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a part of, affiliated to the UN, if you like, where they could go with inspections whenever they wanted in all the facilities that were covered. So it was, I think, a good deal. And what it meant was two things. One, that it prevented Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon for those 15 years. And 15 years is a long time in politics. So in that 15 years, you could have regime change in Tehran, you could have new abilities to attack the program, perhaps offensive cyber weapons, etc., that could be used against the program. So buying 15 years, when it looked as though they would have that capability within 1 year, was very important. And it avoided this famous, used to call the fork in the road, that as you approach the period where you had a fork, where you had to decide either you were going to bomb Iran and try and take out militarily all its nuclear facilities, incidentally would not be easy because they are deep underground, many of them, or the other fork is that you accept, like we have for India and Pakistan, say, that they have acquired nuclear weapons despite the non-proliferation treaty, and you contain them in some other political diplomatic way. That is the fork in the road that the JCPOA avoided or pushed back at least for 15 years. What we're faced with now, having President Trump having pulled out of the deal and essentially the deal falling apart, although the Europeans have never sort of formally advocated it, and nor in fact is Iran completely, but it has started breaching the deal, is that you're going to just bring that fork in the road closer together, closer. So there is an opportunity now to try and reverse that bad decision that I think President Trump made.
Why did he do it? I mean, you say, you know, people like Bolton and Trump say it wasn't verifiable, but I mean, clearly it's just not your opinion. But I mean, the UN, the IAEA clearly has shown us pictures and live camera feeds, and they said it was absolutely verifiable, and that's why the Europeans were willing to stick with the deal. Why did the Americans want to pull out of it? Just for political headline, or you know, how is it understandable?
I think there's a lot of politics in it. I mean, you're right to quote the fact that President Trump had said it was the worst deal ever, and he'd said that before he was elected. I mean, this was during his sort of campaign rhetoric. And fundamentally, it was an Obama deal. You know, the deal was done by President Obama, and everything that President Obama did, President Trump didn't like, whether it was Obamacare internally or a lot of the foreign policy issues. So given that Obama considered the nuclear deal to be a sort of shiny example of his achievements in foreign policy, and to be honest, he didn't have a huge number to point to, but this was perhaps one.
No, and you're not the first one to say that. Yeah,
it was an opportunity to attack it. I think it was probably more that than anything else.
Right, but then you fold in Israel.
John Bolton probably played a role in it, because don't forget that, you know, President Trump had 2 years in office before he pulled out of the deal, and it's not complete coincidence that he did so shortly after John Bolton was appointed as national security advisor.
Right, Bolton was never a favor of dealing with Iran, negotiating with Iran, and was always a proponent of military action against Iran without really ever laying out how that would be successful. Otherwise, Israel probably would have done it on its own. But you roll in Israel too, though. I mean, there's another interloper and a state which didn't think it's a real deal and didn't think that it was verifiable and thought all along that Iran was slowly making the bomb anyway.
Yes, he made that case publicly at the United Nations, I recall, with a big sort of cartoon picture of a bomb and how threatening that was. And I attended talks between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Theresa May in Downing Street when we argued back and forth about the merits of the nuclear deal. I think, and I personally argued the case with Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon and Trump's team when they came into office. So, you know, we knew the arguments that the Israelis were going to make, and we knew the arguments that President Trump's team were going to make, but we simply didn't agree with them. And I think they had perhaps a lack of understanding, not the Israelis, but the Trump team had a slight lack of understanding of the history that had gone into this and the sort of 15 years of negotiations that had led up to the deal. I think Netanyahu's point of view, of course, he wanted Trump to abrogate the deal because he wanted a free hand to try and actually force the fork in the road. I think Israel felt that if fork came, he could persuade the Americans to do the bombing. I mean, Israel could do some itself, but it couldn't wipe out Iran's nuclear facilities on its own.
Now you have Israel that has carried out this, allegedly, this assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. And of course, Netanyahu hasn't commented. And I think the head of his intelligence services has said they don't know who carried out the deal, but certainly Iran thinks it was Israel, and maybe some of the Iranian opposition that is based in Europe, they've accused them as well. Does it achieve anything? Does it roll back a nuclear program by killing the head scientist? And who do you think did it?
I don't know who did it, but I don't think it's unreasonable to conclude that it was probably the Israelis. And I don't think it's unreasonable to conclude that the timing is linked to the fact that President Trump has 2 more months in office. But I think, whereas you could argue, and I think I probably would argue, that the killing of General Soleimani in January this year by the American, right, did have quite a substantive impact on the ability of the Quds force to carry out terrorist operations overseas. But Khomeini was ahead, and he was a very powerful figure. I'm not so sure about Fakhrizadeh. I mean, he's certainly an important scientist, but there are other scientists, and Iran already has the nuclear know-how. It's not as though it needs research. It's more about development of the program rather than actually initiating the research necessary to get the technology right of the research. So I'm less convinced, although I don't know Fakhrizadeh's background and his precise role. I don't think it will have a particularly substantial impact on the program itself. And I think there is a risk that it could have a counterproductive impact for 2 reasons. One, it will reinforce Iranian incentive and determination to press ahead with the program. And also, let's not forget that there are presidential elections in Iran coming in 2021. And President Rouhani may not look like a sort of moderate Democrat, and certainly isn't a moderate Democrat, but as we know from Ahmadinejad and others who have preceded him, there are people who are much more radical and much more hardline than him, who will leap on these sorts of attacks, and it will certainly improve their chances of election.
If whoever carried out this attack was interested in tearing up the pavement for a Biden administration to re-engage with Iran and hoping that Iran will fiercely respond and make the gap between dialogue with the new American administration even larger, do you think that Iran will disappoint them? Are they smart enough to hold back and wait for that moment where they can move to dialogue rather than move to some kind of response, wherever it be?
I think it's difficult to judge that because one can't think about Iran as a monolithic political entity. You know, you can say in Saudi Arabia that all the decisions are taken by one, maybe two people. You can't say that in Iran. You know, it's not a democracy, but there is a plurality of politics in Iran that is completely absent from the Arab states, for instance. So there is a president, he has a role, Rani, but there is the supreme leader, there's the IRGC, there's the Bazaris, there's the Majlis Shura. Now, all of these bodies have an influence in the eventual decision that might be taken in the area. So I think if you look at President Rouhani and the Foreign Minister Zarif, they will certainly want to not close off the possibility of engagement with Joe Biden. But equally, the Israelis probably, absolutely, for the reasons you say, have an interest in making it much more difficult for that re-engagement to take place. And President Trump in his last couple of months may help to facilitate that. So I think there is a risk that Iran will be pushed into a retaliation which would make engagement more difficult, certainly.
Last question to you. You know, you said you got to that fork in the road where, you know, you either had to choose them getting a bomb or you had to choose dialogue. And then the drawbacks in the deal were the fact that you didn't take into, it didn't put a noose around their rocket program, or it didn't bridle malign activities. I mean, it's almost naive to think that a new agreement, even with the best intentions, is suddenly going to deal with all of that. I mean, it's almost, a lot of people would say you have to start somewhere, go back into a nuclear non-proliferation agreement with Iran, and then while you have whatever the period is going to be this time, whether it's going to be another 15 years or up to that 15 years, then you start dealing with some of these other issues. Or do you think it should be a more encompassing, in retrospect, a more encompassing deal?
Well, I think you can try and make it a more encompassing deal. I mean, let's not forget that the original deal, yes, it was restricted to the nuclear program, but that didn't prevent other action taking place at the same time on the ballistic missiles and particularly on the regional role. It didn't rule out anything either then or indeed on the nuclear program at the end of the 15-year period. You know, John Bolton is a good example of someone who says often, look, let's make the problem bigger. So we make the problem bigger, we bring in these other two issues, and then let's sit around and negotiate. And I think there may well be an effort to try and do that. But whether it will be successful or not, we'll see. It wasn't successful in the sort of 15-year negotiations in which I was involved, but there is no doubt that what is constraining the Iranians is the sanctions. They do have economic sanctions. The UN Security Council is united against the nuclear program, so the opportunity for even tougher sanctions. So they are suffering, and that may make them more amenable to some of these wider discussions.
Ambassador Mark Lyall Grant, it's great to have your perspective, somebody who's been in the room and were part of the negotiations as a former national security advisor to two prime ministers here in Britain. Great to talk to you, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure.